The old bus wheezed to a stop at the corner of Fifth Avenue, its brakes making that familiar grinding sound that reminded 12-year-old David of his broken bicycle back home. He pressed his face against the foggy window and watched as his mother gathered her cleaning supplies from the seat beside them. The heavy bag full of spray bottles and rags had seen better days, just like everything else in their lives. "Come on, baby," his mother whispered, adjusting her worn uniform jacket. "We can't be late tonight. Mrs. Patterson is counting on me to finish the whole third floor before the morning classes start." David nodded and followed her off the bus. The moment his feet hit the sidewalk, he felt like he'd stepped into a different world. The Riverside Music Conservatory stretched before them like a palace made of cream-colored stone and gleaming windows. Tall columns supported the entrance, and golden lights made the entire building glow against the dark evening sky. Even the trees lining the walkway looked more expensive than the ones in his neighborhood. His mother pulled out her employee badge and swiped it at the side entrance. The heavy door clicked open, and they stepped inside. David's eyes went wide. The hallway stretched forever in both directions, with polished marble floors that reflected the ceiling lights like a mirror. Oil paintings of serious-looking men in old-fashioned clothes hung in gold frames along the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow him as he walked. "Remember what I told you," his mother said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. "Stay close to me. Don't touch anything. These people pay good money to keep this place perfect, and we need this job." David understood. They'd moved 3 times in the past 2 years, always one step ahead of rent they couldn't pay. This cleaning job at the conservatory was the best work his mother had found since his father left. It paid enough to keep their small apartment and even put a little food in the refrigerator. They walked through hallways lined with practice rooms. Through the small windows in each door, David could see music stands and chairs, all arranged perfectly. Some rooms had violins hanging on the walls. Others had cellos standing in corners like wooden soldiers. The silence felt heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. His mother stopped at a supply closet and pulled out a cart loaded with cleaning equipment. "I have to start on the administrative offices upstairs," she said, checking her watch. "The security guard said it's okay for you to wait in the main lobby, but don't wander around. And absolutely don't go into any of the music rooms." David promised he would stay put, but as soon as his mother disappeared up the staircase with her cart, curiosity got the better of him. He'd never been inside a place like this before. Back home, the closest thing to culture was the old community center where they sometimes showed movies on Friday nights. He walked slowly down the main hallway, his sneakers making small squeaking sounds on the polished floor. The building felt alive somehow, like music was hiding in the walls waiting to escape. He passed trophy cases filled with golden awards and photographs of students in fancy concert clothes. Some of the pictures were signed, though he couldn't read the fancy handwriting. Then he saw it. At the end of the hallway, through 2 enormous glass doors, was the most beautiful room he'd ever seen. The ceiling soared high above, decorated with painted angels and golden designs. Rows of red velvet seats faced a stage, and on that stage, under a pool of soft light, sat a piano unlike anything David had ever imagined. It was huge, bigger than his mother's car, and so black it seemed to absorb the light around it. The lid was propped open, showing the strings inside like the ribs of some magnificent creature. Even from the doorway, David could see his reflection in the polished surface. He tried the door handle. It turned easily. The concert hall felt sacred, like a church, but for music instead of prayers. David's footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet as he walked down the center aisle toward the stage. The piano seemed to grow larger with each step. By the time he reached the edge of the stage, he had to tilt his head back to see the top of it. A small set of steps led up to the stage. David climbed them carefully, his heart beating faster with each step. Up close, the piano was even more incredible. The keys were perfect, not a scratch or stain on any of them. Some were slightly yellowed with age, but in a way that made them look distinguished rather than old. David had been obsessed with pianos for as long as he could remember. It started when he was 7 and found an old keyboard in the dumpster behind their apartment building. Half the keys didn't work, and it ran on batteries he couldn't afford to replace. but he'd spent hours pressing the working keys and imagining the sounds the broken ones would make. He'd taught himself to read music from library books and spent hours watching piano videos on the computers at school during lunch break. His teachers thought he was playing games, but he was actually memorizing finger positions and trying to understand how the greatest pianists in the world made their instruments sing. The keyboard at home only had 61 keys, and some of those didn't make any sound at all. This piano had 88 keys, every single one of them perfect. David's fingers twitched just thinking about what it would feel like to press them down and hear real music come out. He looked around the empty concert hall. The silence was so complete he could hear his own breathing. His mother was upstairs, probably scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans. The security guard was somewhere far away. No one would know if he just touched one key. Just one. David sat down on the piano bench and immediately felt like he was sitting on a throne. The bench was the perfect height, and the keys were positioned exactly right for his hands. He flexed his fingers the way he'd seen concert pianists do in the videos. His right index finger hovered over middle C. That was always the first key he went to, even on his broken keyboard at home. It was like the center of the musical universe, the place where everything began. The silence stretched on. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the faint sound of a vacuum cleaner. His mother, working hard to make sure they could stay in their apartment another month. She'd been cleaning offices and buildings since he was little, always coming home tired but never complaining. Maybe someday, he thought, he could play piano professionally, and his mother wouldn't have to clean buildings anymore. Maybe someday, they could afford their own piano and he could practice whenever he wanted instead of imagining music on silent keys. His finger moved closer to the key, just one note. What could it hurt? The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him freeze. Someone was coming, and they were coming fast. David's hand jerked back from the keys as if they were on fire. His heart pounded as he realized how much trouble he could be in. His mother had warned him. The security guard had probably seen him on the cameras. They were going to throw him out, maybe even call the police. But the footsteps passed by the concert hall doors without stopping. Probably just someone walking to another part of the building. David let out a long breath and looked down at the keys again. They seemed to be calling to him, those perfect black and white rectangles. All his life, he'd dreamed of sitting at a real piano, a piano that worked, a piano that could make the music he heard in his head come alive. Just one key. What was the worst that could happen? David's finger finally touched the key. The sound that came out was nothing like the tinny electronic beeps from his broken keyboard at home. This was pure music, rich and warm, filling the entire concert hall like liquid gold. The note seemed to hang in the air forever, bouncing off the high ceiling and wrapping around him like a hug. He pressed another key, then another. Each sound was perfect, crystal clear, exactly the way he'd always imagined real piano music should sound. His left hand joined his right, and suddenly he was playing a simple melody he'd been practicing in his head for months. The music felt alive under his fingers. Every key responded exactly the way it should, and for the first time in his life, David understood what real piano playing felt like. This wasn't just pressing buttons to make noise. This was creating something beautiful, something that mattered. He was so lost in the music that he didn't hear the voices at first. What in the world is that sound coming from? I thought the conservatory was closed for cleaning tonight. Someone's in the concert hall. David's hands froze above the keys. The beautiful music stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt even heavier than before. His heart started pounding so hard he was sure everyone in the building could hear it. The glass doors at the back of the concert hall swung open, and 3 people walked in. David recognized the type immediately, even though he'd never seen people like this up close before. They wore the kind of clothes that cost more than his mother made in a month. The woman had on a pearl necklace that probably cost more than their rent. The 2 men with her wore suits that looked like they came straight from a magazine.
"There," said the woman, pointing at David with one perfectly manicured finger. "There's your mysterious pianist." David wanted to disappear. He wanted to sink through the floor, or become invisible, or wake up from what was surely a nightmare.
Instead, he sat frozen on the piano bench, his hands still hovering over the keys like he'd been caught stealing. "Excuse me, young man," called one of the men. His voice echoed through the concert hall, formal and cold. "What are you doing in here?" David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His throat felt like sandpaper. These people looked like they owned the world, and he was just a kid in torn jeans and worn-out sneakers who didn't belong anywhere near their fancy piano. The three of them walked down the aisle toward the stage, their expensive shoes clicking on the floor. David could see their expressions getting more disapproving with each step. The woman whispered something to one of the men, and they both shook their heads. "I asked you a question," the man said when they reached the front row of seats. "What are you doing in here? How did you even get inside the building?" My mom," David managed to whisper. "She works here. Cleaning." The woman made a sound like she'd tasted something bitter. "Oh, wonderful. The cleaning lady's son thinks he can just waltz in here and play with our instruments." "Do you have any idea how much this piano costs?" the second man asked. His voice was getting louder, angrier. "This is a Steinway grand piano. It's worth more than most people's houses." David's face burned with shame. He started to slide off the piano bench, but the woman held up her hand. "Stay right there," she said. "Don't you dare touch anything else. Charles, call security. We need to have this boy removed immediately." "Wait," said the first man, pulling out his phone. "I want to record this. Helen, you were just saying how—" "The conservatory needs better security. This is perfect evidence of what happens when we let just anyone into the building." David's stomach dropped. They were going to record him, put him on video looking like a fool, like a thief who'd been caught red-handed. He thought about his mother upstairs working so hard to keep this job so they could stay in their apartment. What would happen when her boss found out her son had been messing around with the expensive instruments? "Please," David said, his voice cracking. "I wasn't trying to hurt anything. I just wanted to hear what it sounded like." "What it sounded like?" The woman laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh. "Honey, this piano is for real musicians, people who've studied for years and years, people who understand the value of what they're touching." The man with the phone was already recording, holding it up to capture David's humiliation. "This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when standards slip," he said, speaking to the camera like he was giving a news report. "Children with no musical training, no respect for fine instruments, just wandering around touching things they have no business touching." David felt tears starting to sting his eyes, but he blinked them back. He wouldn't cry in front of these people. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. "Look at him," the woman continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "He probably doesn't even know how to read music. I bet he's never had a single lesson in his life." She was right, and that made it hurt even worse. David had never had a lesson because lessons cost money they didn't have. He'd never learned from a real teacher because real teachers were for kids whose parents could afford them. Everything he knew about piano came from library books and stolen moments watching videos on school computers. "Ma'am," David tried again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I'll leave right now." "Oh, you'll leave all right," said the second man. "But first, security needs to file a report. We can't have random children wandering around the conservatory touching our instruments. What's next? Are we going to find homeless people sleeping in the practice rooms?" David's face burned hotter. Homeless people. Is that what they thought he was? He looked down at his clothes, seeing them through their eyes for the first time. His jeans had a hole in the knee that his mother had tried to patch with fabric that didn't quite match. His sneakers were clean, but they were old and the soles were starting to separate from the tops. His t-shirt was faded from too many trips through the washing machine at the laundromat. He didn't look like he belonged here. He didn't look like the kind of person who should be allowed near a piano that cost more than his family made in a year. He looked exactly like what he was. Poor kid who had wandered into a place where poor kids weren't welcome. "Security should be here any minute," said the man with the phone still recording. "Helen, make sure you get his information. We'll need to contact his mother about this incident." David's heart nearly stopped. His mother. If they contacted his mother's boss, she could lose her job, they could lose their apartment, they could end up on the street, and it would all be his fault because he couldn't resist touching one stupid piano key. "Please don't tell my mom's boss," David begged. "She really needs this job. We need this job. I promise I'll never come in here again. I promise I won't touch anything else. Just please don't get my mom in trouble." The three adults exchanged looks. For a moment, David thought he saw something that might have been sympathy cross the woman's face. But then she shook her head. "You should have thought about that before you decided to play with things that don't belong to you," she said. "Actions have consequences, young man. Maybe this will teach you to respect other people's property." David heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy footsteps getting closer. Security was coming just like they'd promised. In a few minutes, he'd be escorted out of the building in front of his mother, and everyone would know what he'd done. He looked down at the piano keys one more time. They were still beautiful, still perfect, still everything he'd ever dreamed of playing. But now they felt like they were mocking him, reminding him of everything he couldn't have and would never deserve. The footsteps stopped outside the concert hall doors. The security guard walked through the doors, his heavy boots echoing in the concert hall. David's heart sank as he saw the man's stern expression and the radio clipped to his belt. This was it. This was how everything would end. "What's the situation here?" the security guard asked, looking from the three adults to David sitting frozen at the piano. "We found this boy playing with our Steinway," the woman said, crossing her arms. "He has no business being in here. His mother apparently works for the cleaning service, but that doesn't give him the right to touch our instruments." The security guard nodded and started walking toward the stage. David wanted to run, but his legs felt like they were made of concrete. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but sit there and wait for his world to fall apart. But as the guard got closer, something strange happened. David's hands, which had been shaking with fear just moments before, suddenly felt calm. His fingers found their way back to the piano keys almost like they had a mind of their own. "Please," David whispered so quietly that only he could hear it. "Just one more time." And then, without really deciding to do it, he started to play. The first notes of Chopin's Minute Waltz filled the concert hall, but these weren't the clumsy, hesitant sounds you'd expect from a kid who'd never had lessons. These were the notes of someone who had lived and breathed this music for years. Someone who understood every phrase, every emotion, every delicate touch that made the piece come alive. David's fingers moved across the keys like they were dancing. His left hand played the accompanying rhythm while his right hand sang out the melody, each note perfectly placed, perfectly timed. The music flowed from him like water, natural and effortless, and absolutely beautiful. The security guard stopped, walking. His stern expression changed to one of complete surprise. The three adults who had been so ready to have David thrown out stood frozen, their mouths hanging open. David wasn't thinking about them anymore. He wasn't thinking about being in trouble or getting his mother fired or being humiliated. All he could think about was the music. This was what he'd been dreaming of his entire life. Sitting at a real piano, feeling the keys respond to his touch, hearing the music come out exactly the way it sounded in his head. The Minute Waltz was supposed to be one of the hardest pieces for piano. Professional pianists spent months learning to play it correctly. But David's fingers moved through the complex passages like he'd been playing them forever. Because in a way, he had. He'd been practicing this piece on his broken keyboard at home, imagining what it would sound like on a real piano for over 2 years. As the music continued, more people started appearing in the doorway of the concert hall. A janitor who had been mopping floors in the hallway stopped and peeked inside. 2 security guards from other parts of the building came to see what was happening. Even some of the conservatory's evening staff, who had been working late in their offices, were drawn by the sound of the piano. But David didn't notice any of them. He was lost in the music, completely absorbed in the feeling of finally playing on an instrument that could do justice to the music he'd been carrying inside him for so long. The Minute Waltz built to its dramatic climax. David's hands, flying over the keys in passages that would challenge even advanced students. But he played them flawlessly, with a musical understanding that went far beyond technical skill. This wasn't just someone playing notes on a page. This was someone who truly understood what the music meant. When the piece ended, the silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable silence that had filled the hall before. This was the kind of silence that comes after something extraordinary has happened, when people need a moment to process what they've just experienced. David's hand stayed on the keys for a moment, still feeling the vibrations of the final chord. Slowly, reality started creeping back in. He remembered where he was, remembered the trouble he was in, remembered the people who wanted him thrown out. He turned around on the piano bench, expecting to see angry faces and pointing fingers. Instead, he saw something he'd never seen before in his life. The woman with the pearl necklace had tears in her eyes. The man who had been recording everything with his phone was staring at David like he'd just witnessed a miracle. The security guard stood perfectly still, his mouth slightly open. "How long have you been playing?" the woman asked, her voice completely different from the harsh tone she'd used before. David's throat felt dry. 4 years, he whispered. 4 years? The second man stepped closer to the stage. "Where do you take lessons?" "I don't," David said, his voice getting even quieter. "I taught myself from books and videos." The adults looked at each other like they were having a conversation without words. David couldn't understand the expressions on their faces. They didn't look angry anymore, but he couldn't tell what they were thinking. "You taught yourself to play like that?" the woman asked. David nodded, not trusting his voice anymore. "What do you practice on?" the security guard asked. His voice was gentle now, nothing like the stern tone he'd used when he first walked in. "I have a keyboard at home," David said, "but half the keys don't work anymore." The silence stretched on. David felt like he should say something else, should explain or apologize or promise never to touch their piano again. But before he could speak, the woman stepped closer to the stage. "Play something else," she said. David blinked. "What?" "Play another piece. Anything you want." David looked around the room. More people had gathered now, drawn by the sound of the piano and the buzz of conversation. He saw janitors and security guards, office workers and maintenance staff. All of them were looking at him with the same expression of amazement. His hands found the keys again, and this time he played something completely different. It wasn't a classical piece from a famous composer. It was something he'd made up himself, a melody that had been floating around in his head for months. He'd never been able to play it properly on his broken keyboard, but here, on this perfect piano, it came to life exactly the way he'd always imagined it. The music was sad and hopeful at the same time, like a story about someone who had lost everything but still believed that tomorrow might be better. It spoke of dreams that seemed impossible, and wishes that felt too big for the world to hold. As he played, David noticed that even more people were gathering. Through the glass doors, he could see faces pressed against the windows. Word was spreading through the building that something extraordinary was happening in the concert hall. When he finished his own composition, the applause started immediately. Not polite, proper conservatory applause, but real, heartfelt clapping, from people who had just heard something that moved them. The janitors clapped just as hard as the well-dressed adults. The security guards whistled and cheered. David turned around on the piano bench again, and this time he couldn't hide his amazement. The concert hall was packed with people, all of them looking at him like he was some kind of miracle. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. From the back of the concert hall, a woman in her 50s pushed through the crowd. She moved with purpose, her eyes never leaving David as she made her way down the center aisle. Unlike the others who had gathered to listen, she wasn't clapping or smiling. Her face was serious, focused, like she was solving a puzzle in her head. David noticed her immediately. There was something different about the way she carried herself, something that made everyone else step aside as she approached. She wasn't dressed as fancy as the 3 people who had first discovered him, but she had an air of authority that made David sit up straighter on the piano bench. "Excuse me," she said to the woman with the pearl necklace. "I'm Professor Williams, head of piano studies here at the conservatory. I was in my office when I heard the playing. May I ask what's happening here? The woman with the pearls looked embarrassed now, like she'd been caught doing something wrong. We found this boy playing the Steinway without permission. His mother works for the cleaning service, and he just started playing. Professor Williams nodded slowly, but her eyes stayed on David. And how long has he been playing? He says 4 years, the security guard answered. Says he taught himself. Professor Williams raised an eyebrow. She walked closer to the stage, studying David like he was a rare book she'd discovered in a dusty library. 4 years of self-teaching, and you can play Chopin's Minute Waltz like that? David felt his cheeks burning again, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was from the intensity of her stare, like she was looking right through him and seeing things he didn't even know were there. Yes, ma'am, he whispered. What else can you play? The question hung in the air. David's mind raced through all the pieces he'd learned over the years, all the melodies he'd practiced on his broken keyboard, all the music he'd memorized from library books and internet videos. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, he said quietly. Bach's Prelude in C major, some Mozart, and some jazz pieces I learned from YouTube. Professor Williams blinked. Jazz? David nodded. I like how you can change the music, make it your own. Classical pieces are beautiful, but with jazz you can tell your own story. A murmur went through the crowd. David heard someone whisper, a 12-year-old talking about musical interpretation like that? Professor Williams stepped even closer. Show me, she said. Ma'am? Show me the jazz. Play something. David's hands trembled slightly as he turned back to the piano. Jazz was different from classical music. It required confidence, creativity, the willingness to take risks and make mistakes. He'd never played jazz for anyone before, only for himself in the privacy of his own room with his broken keyboard. But something about Professor Williams made him want to try. She didn't look at him like he was a poor kid who didn't belong. She looked at him like he was a musician, period. He started with a simple blues progression, something he'd heard in an old movie soundtrack. His left hand laid down the basic rhythm while his right hand explored the melody. But as he got more comfortable, the music started to change. He added flourishes, unexpected chord changes, little runs that made the piano sound like it was laughing. Crowd grew quiet again, but this was a different kind of quiet. Before, they'd been amazed by his technical skill. Now they were hearing something else entirely. They were hearing a young artist finding his voice, expressing something that came from deep inside him. David lost himself in the improvisation. He thought about his life, about the long bus rides with his mother to her night jobs, about the times they'd had to choose between buying groceries and paying the electric bill, about the dreams he'd carried for so long that he'd almost forgotten. They were dreams and not just fantasies. The music told all of it, the sadness and the hope, the loneliness and the love, the way it felt to want something so desperately that it hurt to breathe. His fingers found notes that expressed things he'd never been able to put into words. When he finally brought the improvisation to a close, the silence lasted even longer than before. David turned around slowly, unsure of what he'd see on the faces looking back at him. Professor Williams was crying, not just tears in her eyes like the woman with the pearls had earlier. Real tears rolling down her cheeks like she'd just watched something that broke her heart and put it back together at the same time. In 30 years of teaching, she said, her voice shaky, I have never heard anything like that from someone so young. The man who had been recording everything with his phone stepped forward. David had forgotten he was still there, still capturing everything that was happening. Professor Williams, the man said, I owe this young man an apology. We all do. I'm Robert Blackwood. My family founded this conservatory and I sit on the board of directors. What we just witnessed, this is exactly why this institution exists. David's eyes went wide. This man who had been so angry with him just an hour ago was a founder of the conservatory, and now he was apologizing? I was wrong, Mr. Blackwood continued, putting his phone away. I saw a kid in old clothes touching our piano and I assumed the worst. I forgot that music doesn't care about money or status or what neighborhood you come from. Music only cares about one thing, whether you have something real to say. Professor Williams wiped her eyes and walked up the steps to the stage. What's your name, son? David, ma'am. David, I need to ask you something important and I want you to tell me the truth. Have you ever had formal lessons? Even one or two? David shook his head. No, ma'am. We can't afford lessons. Music theory classes? Workshops, anything? Just library books and videos online when I can get to a computer. Professor Williams looked out at the crowd, then back at David. This is impossible, she said, but she was smiling when she said it. What you just played, the way you understand, harmony, the way you feel the music. Most of my college students can't do what you just did. David didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought of himself as special or gifted. He just loved music, loved the way it made him feel, loved the way it could turn his tiny apartment into a concert hall and his broken keyboard into a window to another world. David, Professor Williams said, how would you like to study here? At the conservatory? The words hit David like a physical blow. Study here? At this beautiful place with its perfect pianos and its halls full of music history? It was impossible. It was a dream too big to even dream. We can't afford, he started to say. Full scholarship, Mr. Blackwood interrupted. Full tuition, books, everything. And if there are other expenses, my family's foundation will cover those too. David's mouth fell open. The crowd started murmuring excitedly, but he couldn't process what they were saying. This had to be a mistake. Things like this didn't happen to kids like him. Scholarships went to students who'd been taking lessons since they were 5. Kids whose parents drove them to competitions and recitals. Kids who belonged in places like this. But I don't know anything, David said. I mean, I can play, but I don't know the proper way to do things. I don't even know how to sit at the piano correctly. Professor Williams laughed, and it was the warmest sound David had heard all evening. David, technique can be taught. Music theory can be learned, but what you have, what we just heard, that can't be taught. That's a gift, and it's rarer than you know. From somewhere in the crowd, David heard footsteps running down the aisle. He turned to see his mother pushing through the people, her cleaning cart abandoned somewhere behind her. Her face was panicked, like she expected to find him in handcuffs. David, what's going on? Someone said security was called and... She stopped talking when she saw him sitting at the piano, saw the crowd of people, saw the tears still drying on Professor Williams' cheeks. Mom, David said, his voice barely audible, I think everything just changed. 6 months later, David stood backstage at the Riverside Music Conservatory's annual spring gala, adjusting his bow tie for the 10th time in 5 minutes. The formal concert clothes still felt strange on him, like he was wearing a costume from someone else's life. But when he looked in the mirror, he saw something he'd never seen before, a real pianist, getting ready for a real performance. The sounds of the audience drifting through the curtains made his stomach flutter with nervous excitement. Tonight was different from all the practice sessions and small recitals he'd given over the past months. Tonight, he was the featured performer at the conservatory's biggest event of the year. His mother appeared beside him, beautiful in a dress that Professor Williams had insisted on buying for the occasion. She'd been crying on and off all day, but they were happy tears, the kind that come when dreams you never dared to hope for suddenly become real. You ready, baby? She asked, straightening his collar one more time. David nodded, though his hands were shaking slightly. I think so. I mean, I know the music by heart. I've practiced it 100 times. 1,000 times, his mother corrected with a smile. I should know. I've heard every single practice session through our thin apartment walls. They'd moved to a new apartment 3 months ago, one with better heating and windows that actually closed properly. Mr. Blackwood's foundation had covered the deposit and first year's rent, calling it an educational investment. But the best part wasn't the nicer furniture or the working refrigerator. The best part was the upright piano that now sat in their living room, donated by a conservatory alumnus who'd heard David's story. It wasn't a grand piano like the Steinway in the concert hall, but it was real, and it was theirs, and David could practice whenever he wanted without worrying about bothering anyone. His mother had gotten used to falling asleep to the sound of Chopin nocturnes and waking up to Bach inventions. Professor Williams appeared backstage, looking elegant in her concert gown. Over the past 6 months, she'd become more than just David's teacher. She'd become a mentor, a champion, and something close to a second mother. She'd worked with him every day after his regular classes ended, patient with his questions, encouraging when he struggled, amazed by how quickly he absorbed everything she taught him. "How are we feeling?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "Terrified," David admitted. "There are 300 people out there. And they're all here because they want to hear you play," Professor Williams reminded him. "Remember, 6 months ago you were playing for an audience of broken keys and empty rooms. Tonight you're playing for people who understand and appreciate music. They're on your side." David took a deep breath and looked through a gap in the curtains. The concert hall was packed. He recognized some faces from that first night. Mr. Blackwood was in the front row. The woman with the pearl necklace was there too. And even the security guard who'd first come to kick him out was sitting near the back in his best suit. But there were new faces too. Music critics from the city, newspapers, talent scouts from record labels, other musicians who'd heard about the kid who'd taught himself to play and wanted to see what all the fuss was about. The lights dimmed, and Professor Williams walked out onto the stage to introduce him. David couldn't hear her exact words over the pounding of his heart, but he caught phrases like extraordinary talent and reminder of why music matters and the future of classical piano. Then it was time. David walked out onto the stage, the same stage where his life had changed 6 months ago. The applause was warm and encouraging, but he barely heard it. All his attention was focused on the piano, waiting for him under the spotlights. It was the same Steinway he'd touched that first night, but now he approached it differently. This time he belonged here. This time he was invited. This time the piano wasn't just an impossible dream. It was his instrument, his voice, his way of telling the world who he really was. He sat down at the bench and adjusted it to the perfect height, just like Professor Williams had taught him. The audience grew quiet, waiting. David placed his hands on the keys and felt the familiar thrill of possibility that came right before the music began. Tonight's program was special. Instead of playing traditional classical pieces that everyone expected, David had convinced Professor Williams to let him perform something unique, a musical autobiography he'd composed himself over the past month. The piece began softly, with simple melodies that represented his childhood. The music painted pictures of small apartments and bus rides, of dreams that seemed too big for the world to hold. As his hands moved across the keys, David told the story of growing up poor but rich in imagination, of finding music in the most unlikely places. The second movement was darker, more complex. It captured the loneliness he'd felt before that first night at the conservatory, the sense of being on the outside of a world he desperately wanted to join. The music was full of longing and frustration, but also determination. Even in the saddest passages, there was an underlying strength that suggested the story wasn't over yet. Then came the moment that represented that first night 6 months ago. The music erupted into the opening of Chopin's Minute Waltz, but David's version was different from the original. He'd woven his own melodies into Chopin's framework, creating something that honored the master while telling his own story. As he played, David thought about everything that had changed. His mornings now started with music theory class instead of worrying about whether they'd have money for breakfast. His afternoons were filled with piano lessons and chamber music rehearsals instead of lonely hours waiting for his mother to come home from work. But the biggest change wasn't in his circumstances. It was in how he saw himself. 6 months ago, he'd been a poor kid who loved music but didn't believe he deserved to pursue it. Now he was a musician, period. A young artist with something important to say and the skills to say it beautifully. The final movement of his composition was pure joy. It celebrated second chances and the power of music to change lives. It honored everyone who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. It was a thank you note written in melody and harmony, a promise that he would never forget where he came from or take for granted where he was going. As the piece built to its climax, David's hands flew across the keys with complete confidence. This wasn't the nervous boy who'd been afraid to touch a single key. This was an artist in full control of his instrument, using it to paint emotions in sound. The final chord rang out, filling the concert hall with its rich harmonies. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the audience erupted in applause unlike anything David had ever heard. People were standing cheering, some of them crying. In the front row, Mr. Blackwood was applauding so hard his hands must have hurt. David stood up and bowed, but he couldn't stop smiling. As he looked out at the audience, he saw his mother in the third row, tears streaming down her face, clapping, like her life depended on it. After the formal reception, when the last congratulations had been given and the last business cards exchanged, David found himself alone with the piano one more time. The concert hall was empty now except for a few staff members cleaning up. He sat down at the bench and played a few quiet notes, the same middle C he'd been so afraid to touch 6 months ago. But now it wasn't about fear or permission or belonging. It was just about music, pure and simple. Professor Williams found him there 20 minutes later, still playing softly in the empty hall. "Regrets?" she asked. David shook his head. "Just grateful," he said. 6 months ago I thought music was something other people got to do, something I could only dream about. And now? David smiled and played a few more notes, a simple melody that somehow contained everything he was feeling. "Now I know that music doesn't care where you come from or what you wear, or how much money your family has. Music only cares about one thing." "What's that?" "Whether you have something real to say." As they walked out of the concert hall together, David took one last look at the piano. Tomorrow he'd be back for practice. Next month he'd give another recital. Next year he might even perform with the City Symphony. But tonight had been perfect. Tonight he'd told his story in the only language that really mattered. And everyone had listened.